Welcome dear students. In today's lecture, we will attempt to understand about the contribution of one of the greatest scholars of the field of comparative politics, namely Gabriel Almond. In our discussion, we will specially focus on his contribution towards developing the notion of political culture in the field of comparative politics. Therefore, this lecture will have following objectives. First, knowing about Gabriel Almond's overall academic and scholarly contribution to the field of comparative politics, his role and contribution in developing the notion of political culture within the field of comparative politics, his analysis of components and types of political culture based on his co-author text Civic Culture. Now let's start. The political culture of a nation refers to the basic attitudes and orientation of its people towards the political system. It involves the loyalty of the people to the political system, their reaction to the political events, and their faith on the fundamental issues and forms of the political system. The political culture conditions and shapes all three of the inputs flowing from the society into the political system, such as support, expectations, and demands. Gabriel Almond is generally recognized as the dean of the contemporary political culture theory and has done a remarkable work in collaboration with his colleagues Sidney Verba to bring the notion of political culture within the ambit of comparative politics. Not just in political culture, Gabriel Almond is a household name when it comes to the overall development of comparative politics as an independent field of study. In today's lecture, we will specially focus on his contribution in developing the notion of political culture in the field of comparative politics. We will first attempt to get acquainted with Gabriel Almond's overall academic and scholarly contribution within the field of comparative politics. After that, we will come directly to the entry of the notion of political culture in the academic and scholarly scope of comparative politics and his contribution. We will then discuss the components and types of political culture, mostly based on his classic texts written in collaboration with Sidney Verba, which is titled as Civic Culture, which was published in 1963. So dear students, let's start with Gabriel Almond's contribution. Gabriel A. Almond was one of the most original political scientists of the second half of the 20th century. He carried out major works on public opinion and foreign policy. He did pioneering work on political culture, making the study of the subject much more systematic. Almond was the leading figure in the field of comparative politics, in which he broke down the single country focus and made the field truly comparative. He brought sophisticated psychological analysis into the study of politics, and he ended his long career with significant work on religious fundamentalism. The first major work that Almond published in 1950 was The American People and Foreign Policy, which is concerned as one of the remarkable works in behavioral political science. In this book, Almond used survey data to explain the periodic swings of American public opinion towards international affairs. He examined the trajectory of American public opinion from idealistic to cynical attitudes, from a support for withdrawal to support for intervention, and from optimism to pessimism. In his second major book, The Appeals of Communism, published in 1954, Almond, besides using surveys, resorted to in-depth interviews to demonstrate the fundamentally different nature of the appeals of the communism in countries where it was the normal ideology of the working class and in countries where it was a less class-based manifestation of alienation. Almond's most enduring contribution was to the systematic study of comparative politics. The Civic Culture, co-authored with Sidney Verba, published in 1963, was one of the first large-scale cross-national survey studies. With its examination of the cultural roots of democracy in 5 nations, it opened the new field of comparative surveys and was one of the first attempts to study cultural factors in comparative politics systematically. The civic culture spawned much additional research, some written to replicate it, some to present alternate positions, and some that went beyond it. In The Politics of the Developing Areas, published in 1962, Almond, along with James S. Coleman, proposed a broad analytical framework for identifying the basic institutions and processes of social change. In Crisis, Choice and Change, published in 1973, Almond and his collaborators considered the role of citizenship and strategic choice in political change. A number of his articles were brought together and published as a book, and that was titled as A Discipline Divided in 1990. Almond deplored the divisions in political science. What he believed to have been a more unified, though pluralistic, discipline was now to use the phrase that became standard in the field to describe the unease he and others felt seated at separate tables, unable and unwilling to collaborate. He described the discipline as divided into 2 tendencies. Those who viewed the discipline as a hard science, formal, mathematical, statistical, experimental, dedicated to the accumulation of tested covering laws, and those who are less sanguine and more eclectic, who view all scholarly methods, the scientific ones as well as the softer historical, philosophical and legal ones, as appropriate and useful. Almond identified with the second school because he thought that the qualities of human culture and behavior were not explicable by hard and fixed laws. It was not so much that he rejected a scientific approach, rather he wanted a political science that was open to many approaches, a political science that was empirical and whose conclusions were open to testing and falsification. His objection was to premature closure in the name of overarching theories. Rational choice theory was his prime example of the latter. To Almond, politics was too important and too complicated to be encompassed in any particular approach. He wanted us all around the same table arguing it out. Few scholars have had as broad and sustained an impact on political science in general and comparative politics in particular. Almond's first publication was his 1934 research on bureaucratic behavior in welfare offices. His last, Strong Religions, appeared shortly after his death in 2003. 7 decades of creativity is a record few scholars attain. The 1934 article, co-authored with Laswell, represented an innovative approach to citizen encounters with government. Looking at the social and psychological micro-interactions of citizens face to face with officials. It was an approach that would be followed in many later works, and the article was about one of the most important substantive issues of that Depression era: how government provides assistance to its needy citizens. The last book about fundamentalism is on one of the most important substantive issues at the beginning of the 21st century, and it too will provide a template for further research in this important area. Almond straddles Asa Berlin's famous distinction: he was neither a fox that knows many things nor a hedgehog that knows one big thing. Rather, he was a person who knew many big things. Almond was a producer of large-scale classifications and approaches who never abandoned close empirical work, a generalist who accepted the variety of particular nations and cultures, an early user of quantitative approaches who never abandoned history. Some of Almond's schemes have been modified or replaced by others. Almond would have, and he did, welcome changes and modifications to his work and assumed that others move beyond it. 7 decades of productivity, a long life and a fruitful life. Gabriel Almond died on Christmas Day 2002, just before his 92nd birthday. In this lecture, we will specially focus on Almond's analysis of political culture, which has dominated the field of comparative politics since its emergence as an independent field of study. Now, let's discuss the entry of political culture in comparative politics. Now, before going to discuss the trajectory of the evolution of the term political culture in comparative politics, let's begin first by a brief understanding of the term. A prominent political culture theorist laments that the term culture, unfortunately, has no precise, settled meaning in the social sciences. There are several definitions of political culture by different scholars dealing with different perspectives. The International Encyclopedia of the Social Science defines political culture as, and I quote, the set of attitudes, beliefs, and sentiments that give order and meaning to a political process, and what provides the underlying assumptions and rules that govern behavior in the political system. Unquote. Gabriel Almond and Sidney Verba in 1963 stated that political culture refers specifically to the political orientations and attitudes towards the political system and its various parts and attitudes towards the role of the self in the system. Sidney Verba defined political culture as, and I quote, the system of beliefs about the pattern of political interaction and political institutions, unquote. And those beliefs are fundamental, usually unstated and unchallengeable assumptions or postulates about politics. He also established a denotative criterion of political culture for subsequent political culture studies by distinguishing it from other specific political psychological constructs such as partisan affiliation and attitudes or beliefs about domestic and international policy issues. According to Lucian Pye, political culture involves attributes including attitudes, feelings, sentiments, beliefs, and values which concern the nature of politics that give form and substance to political processes. From these definitions, it can be derived that political culture is a shorthand expression to denote the emotional and attitudinal environment within which the political system operates. In this process, a set of political beliefs, values, and attitudes influences people's political behaviors, and their political behaviors then become a pattern and their political culture. In other words, it is the overall distribution of citizens' orientation to political objects. It gives the impression of the very political processes of a given political system. Thus, this approach of political culture can be used to distinguish one political system from the other. It is, therefore, an important approach in understanding the varied dimensions of comparative politics. It is pertinent to point out that the term political culture, as a more or less technical concept, did not appear until 1956 in comparative politics. The first explicit attempt to introduce the term political culture is found in Almond's article, that is, Comparative Political Systems, which was published in 1956 in the August issue of Journal of Politics. Every political system, writes Almond, is embedded in a particular pattern of orientations to political action, and I have found it useful to refer to this as the political culture. Almond states that the concept of political culture does not coincide with a political system or society. For patterns of orientation to politics may and usually do extend beyond the boundaries of political system. For Almond, the political culture is related to but not identical with the general culture. He says it is a differentiated part of the culture and has a certain autonomy. Almond goes on to suggest that the United States, Great Britain, and some Commonwealth countries have a common political culture, but are separate and different kinds of political system. The Anglo-American system is said to have a homogeneous secular political culture, while the continental European political system is characterized by the fragmentation of political culture. The pre-industrial system is described as mixed political cultures, and the totalitarian political culture is declared synthetic, though having the appearance of being homogeneous. Almond suggested that the term ideology should be specifically confined to the systematic and explicit formulation of a general orientation to politics. Since the concept of political culture should be able to encompass the vaguer and more implicit orientation. Other terms such as attitudes towards politics, political values, national character, and cultural ethos are rejected on the ground that their meanings are unstable and overlapping. For Almond, in short, a pattern of orientations to political actions, both explicit and implicit, constitutes a political culture. In his 1958 article, Almond observes that all non-Western political systems appear to have in common, among other things, a fragmented political culture as a consequence of Westernization. In many cases, added on to an indigenous cultural heterogeneity. The French society is described as culturally and politically fragmented. Moreover, Almond employs the following term rather freely without having to use the concept of political culture: ideologies, popular attitudes, interest groups, conceptions of the political arena and of the rules of the game, the ethos and the expectations and attitudes of the various interests in the society. In his most recent work, the concept of political culture is overshadowed by his functional categories. However, the term makes appearance on some 30 pages out of 64-page chapter. Moreover, he specifically cites the concept of political culture as being one of the several concepts that have gained some currency and their utilities tested. The term political culture is presented as a new preferable term for public opinion, and the terms orientations and attitudes are still used at a number of places. Now, dear students, let's discuss the civic culture and types of political culture. Almond and Verba's pioneering study of political culture, the civic culture, which was published in 1963, is as much a reflection of the dominance of behaviorist and functionalist approaches in the post-war period as it is a reaction against the legal institutionalist paradigm that had commanded political science since the end of the 19th century. Some historical events were also important in promoting awareness of the special interest of political culture as a research topic. For instance, the collapse of constitutional regimes in Germany, Italy, and Spain in the 1920s and 1930s raised questions as to the advocacy of institutionalist analysis that had predicted the gradual spread of liberal democratic regimes and Enlightenment values. A typical product of the political sociology of 1950s and early 1960s is that it sought to catalogue and reproduce the conditions for the expansion of representative democracy. The civic culture rapidly soon gained the status of a classic. It is also a classic that confines rather than expands disciplinary understandings. In the work, political culture comes narrowly defined as the pattern of orientations to political institutions, conventions, and traditions, which include parties, courts, constitutions, and the history of the country. Orientations are predispositions to political action and are determined by a vast set of factors, including tradition, historical memories, norms, emotions, and symbols. Such orientations are the result of cognition, that is, knowledge and awareness of political objectives, affection, that is, emotions and feelings about the object, and evaluation, that is, judgments about those objects. Almond and Verba proceed to articulate the concept of political culture empirically in sample surveys that they apply in 5 democratic countries: the United States, Mexico, Great Britain, Germany, and Italy. The Swiss culture's major empirical finding is the identification of 3 different types of political cultures, resulting in a typology on which a theory of the cultural basis of stable democracy was to be erected. Before discussing the 3 major types of political culture, it is important to discuss the important dimensions of political culture on the basis of which Almond and Verba classify political cultures into 3 types. They identify the 5 major dimensions, or we can say the components of political culture. First, a sense of national identity, attitudes towards oneself as a participant in political life, attitudes towards one's fellow citizens, attitudes and expectations regarding governmental output and performance, and attitudes towards knowledge about the political process of decision making. Based on these dimensions, Almond and Verba have classified political culture into the 3 major types. First, parochial political culture. This refers to a political culture where citizens are only distantly aware of the existence of central government, as with remote tribes whose existence is seemingly unaffected by national decisions made by the central government. Further, there is no political orientation towards political objects. People have neither knowledge nor interest in politics. They have no orientations towards all components of politics. This type of political culture is compatible with a traditional political structure. This type of orientation is found in a passive society where there is hardly any specialization of roles, and therefore people are indifferent towards governmental authority. Thus, in this type of political culture, people have low awareness, expectations, and participations. Now, coming to the second type of political culture, that is subject political culture. In this political culture, or rather we can say in this type of political culture, citizens see themselves not as the participant in the political process, but as the subject of the government, as with people living under a dictatorship. In other words, citizens under this political culture have a passive orientation towards a political system and conceive themselves as having a minimum influence on the political process. In this type of political culture, citizens are aware of the central government and are heavily subjected to its decisions with little scope for dissent. The individual is aware of politics, its actors and institutions. Citizens have orientations towards the output aspect of the system. People know about decision-making mechanisms. There is a political awareness but no confidence to air political waves. Thus, there is an absence of participatory norms. This type of political culture is compatible with a centralized authoritarian structure. In this model, the people have a higher level of awareness and expectations but low participation. Now, dear students, let's discuss the most important part, that is participant political culture. In this type of political culture, citizens believe that they can contribute to the system and that they are affected by it. They therefore respond positively to all political objects and have an active orientation to political activities. Here, citizens can influence the government in various ways and they are affected by it. The individual is oriented towards the system, towards all four components of politics, that is input, output, political system and self-rule. This encourages more and more participation, and participation is the highest value. There is an ability to criticize the authority and hold a positive orientation towards the political system. In this model, people have a high level of awareness, expectation and participation. So, Almond and Verba argue that there is never a single political culture. The three categories of political orientations which they have identified are not always present in a pure form. Rather, they are intermixed in many situations of political culture. Thus, they reclassified political culture into three subtypes. These are parochial and subject. Now, these are the mixed types of political cultures. This type of political culture represents a shift from parochial orientation to subject orientation. Here, the parochial loyalties gradually get weathered and the inhabitants develop a greater awareness of the central authority. Second, subject and participant. Now, this type of political culture represents a shift from subject political orientation to participant political orientation. In such a political culture, people generally, on the one hand, develop an activist tendency and participate in the process. But on the other hand, there are those individuals too who possess passive orientations and remain at the receiving end of the decision-making process. Now, the other type they discuss is parochial and participant. This type of political culture represents the parochial orientation in the individuals, whereas the norms introduced require a participant political orientation. In such type of political culture, there emerges a problem of harmony between the political culture and political norm. However, Almond and Verba suggests that a participatory political culture fits a liberal democratic regime. The participant political culture is the type of political culture that is congruent with a democratic political structure, and the same has been called by them as civic culture. Dear students, let's come to the conclusion now. Gabriel Almond has been a remarkable scholar in the field of comparative politics. He is credited with developing a new conceptual terminology of the field by making the discipline of comparative politics as a vibrant and independent field of study. He has written a number of fundamental texts, many of which are considered a must read for students in the domain of comparative politics. Besides his innovative work on structural functionalism, Almond has been at the forefront of bringing the cultural thrust in comparative politics. It's Almond, the acknowledged dean of political culture theory, who is credited with introducing the notion of political culture in comparative politics in one of his research papers published in 1958. However, it was the publication of his co-authored book, Civic Culture, with Sidney Verba, which is considered as the landmark classic text as far as political culture is concerned. He defines political culture as a set of attitudes, cognitions, value standards, and feelings towards the political system. Besides developing the famous tripartite typology of political culture, including parochial, subject, and participant political culture, he, along with Verba, also develops the notion of what came to be characterized as civic culture. I will end here, dear students. I hope you would have enjoyed the lecture. Thank you.